My name is Laura Beach. I was a Concordia student from 2007 to 2012. I finished with a double major anthropology, human geography. And when I started in my first semester at Concordia, I co-founded an environmental organization called Tap Thirst, Tap Drinkers Against Privatization, with my good friend Alyssa Campbell. And it was an organization dedicated to promoting awareness of the issues, the socioeconomic and environmental issues surrounding bottled water. So we started looking at how we could move the university towards a bottled water-free campus. In so doing, we came across the nature of exclusivity contracts within the university context as a major barrier in shifting towards not just a bottled water-free campus, but later we became more concerned with a more sustainable food and beverage system on the whole. So later on, in 2010, I was one of the first interns for the Concordia Food Systems Project, supervised by Satoshi Aikida and Cameron Stiff. And after that, in 2012, I sat on the Board of Governors as a undergraduate representative.
Great. So could you recount the story about the beverage contracts when you were a student and activist at Concordia?
Sure thing. So the exclusivity contract was a bit of an enigma for me. I started trying to look into it actually in 2007, 2008, and was shut out very quickly by the director of Hospitality Concordia at that time. Was told there's no way that you could ever have access to any of the information concerning the contract is set in stone, and if you're interested in learning anything about it, you have to invoke the Access to Information Act. And that was it, that was all. That was the end of communication there. So with that, having met that sort of coming up against that brick wall, the organization, Tap Thirst, decided to start promoting awareness of bottled water and really attempting to grow awareness within the student body, make allies within Concordia administration with certain professors and departments, and really try and build a movement towards a bottled water-free campus. It came to our attention that the exclusivity contract with PepsiCo was slated to expire December 2010. So in 2009, we started working towards liaising with various members of the university, trying to figure out, okay, how can students have a say in whether or not another contract of this kind gets signed, or maybe in thinking about more sustainable possibilities. So I started speaking with Joanne de Cubelis, who is the interim director of Hospitality Concordia, trying to figure out what steps we, the students, could take to open up some dialogue about the nature of food and beverage systems in the university, and find little avenues for concrete change. So one thing that came up was the issue of an RFP. Joanne had told me any criteria that you're talking about in terms of no bottled water, healthy drinks, locally sourced, organic, non-exclusive even contracts, all of that needs to be framed within a request for proposal that we will put out. Other, like multiple companies or corporations or food and beverage service providers can bid on that, and whoever meets the criteria gets the contract. It sounds very democratic, very fair, and also very open to influence. So Faisal Shanib, the environmental coordinator, who also works very closely with Sustainable Concordia, and I started sort of opening up a dialogue with Joanne and also with Marc Gauthier, the executive director of business and financial operations at the time, now university treasurer. Mark told us that it was he who, on behalf of the university, would decide whether or not an RFP process took place, whether or not there was a straight renewal of the PepsiCo contract, and what that RFP would entail. So their suggestion was for myself, for any of the students who are interested in chiming in on what criteria would determine the fate of this contract, the fate of the food and beverage system essentially at the university, to get in touch with the Environmental Advisory Committee, who reports to the VP Services and on which sit a number of university administrators, faculty, a representative from the Graduate Students Union, and a representative from the Concordia Students Union. So we attended a meeting with the Environmental Advisory Committee. That would have been May 12th, 2010, and the meeting went so well. It was like everybody was on board. Of course it should be sustainable. What does that mean? Local, yes. Organic, yes. Non-exclusive, yes. You know, so Faisal and myself had compiled sort of a list of things that we were looking for, and I didn't even have to bring them up. It was there in the room. There was this general consensus that we needed to change. Concordia saw itself as a leader in sustainability, and we needed to, as a university community, step up, fulfill the obligations we had outlined for ourselves in the university's own environmental policy and strategic plan of action, and really be a leader in sustainability. Really commit to those purchasing policies that were set in place. So the Environmental Advisory Committee passed a motion with a clear set of recommendations outlined, and I was, Faisal and I were tasked with bringing that to Marc Gauthier. And he was going to be communicating with Michael DeGrappa, the VP Services, and in that way the student's voice was meant to be incorporated into the process. Marc also was very keen on this idea of consumer loyalty and the fact that Concordia had an exclusivity contract with PepsiCo for 10 years, which we found out later was actually 13 years because somebody forgot to sign a piece of paper, so Pepsi had 3 free years before it came back and said, hey, can you sign X here? Our 10 years starts now. So 13 years of this exclusivity contract, and for the students this meant long enough, time for change. And for Marc Gauthier, this meant so long we owe them the opportunity to sit down and talk about how they could possibly try and meet some of these criteria. So we left that meeting with the verbal agreement. Marc Gauthier said, we aren't going to move on this PepsiCo contract. We won't do anything. Nothing will be done, including incorporating any of your criteria, until we can sit down, the students and Pepsi and myself, all of the key stakeholders together, and talk about how Pepsi could possibly meet these criteria or what these criteria are and how they would be incorporated into the contract process. So in the meantime, he tasked me with a number of things to do, which were very time-consuming and very exhausting and very impossible, including coming up with a cost-benefit analysis of going with an alternative food and beverage service provider versus an exclusivity contract. This in and of itself was inherently impossible because I didn't know what the terms of the exclusivity contract were. Not only the financial compensation, but any obligations on behalf of the university in terms of consumption quotas or extending the length of the contract for any other reasons, for any other breach in contract. So I had no idea what they would be facing. You know, would the university face a financial penalty for not renewing? I don't know. Marc himself said that he wasn't sure, he wasn't clear on some of these points because the contract was really thick and he'd never read through the entire thing and he had inherited it from his predecessor. So I told him that I would be happy to read it for him, and he said no. So I went about trying to construct a cost-benefit analysis without any numbers to work with and without any concrete information to work with. But I looked into a number of alternative food and beverage service providers. I looked into Koyo Foods and a few other service providers that do service larger corporations and institutions, organizations, and that might be able to compete at the level of the university. So having done all of that, I was also tasked with compiling a fact sheet about bottled water to send to Michael DeGrappa and an executive summary of the criteria and the student movement's position. The organization also made contact with a number of of media outlets in Montreal and made contact. We're working very closely with the Polaris Institute in Ottawa and a few other campuses. We had a letter of recommendation come from the University of Ottawa's Office of Sustainability saying, hey, the University of Ottawa's gone bottled water free. We hear you guys are thinking of doing the same thing. Great job. If you have any questions, you can come to us. So this was a letter sent from the Office of Sustainability at Ottawa U to Judith Woodsworth, the then president of Concordia. So with all of this stuff going on, it was also the summer, and I had decided to stay in Montreal. A lot of the members of Tap Thirst that were also part of the student movement were gone over the summer. A lot of the administration was on holiday, vacation, etc. So this meeting with Pepsi kept getting delayed and delayed. Sorry, Michael DeGrappa's on vacation. Sorry, Marc Gauthier out of town. Sorry, the meeting can't happen. Pepsi can't make it. And it got stalled and stalled and stalled while my plate was piled ever higher with bureaucratic hoops to jump through, with the intention that this would help secure a place for the student voice in this decision-making process. School started in September. The meeting still hadn't taken place. Faisal Shinib contacted Joanne Descubellis to find out what was going on. And she emailed us, and I provided a copy of that email to the Montreal Gazette. They never published it. To the Link, who did refer to it but never published it in its entirety, but sent an email reiterating the verbal agreement that Marc Gauthier had made, stating that, I quote, there has been no movement on the Pepsi file, and that they were still waiting for this meeting to take place before any movement would be made. So on October the 26th, I was tipped off by a member of the Concordia Student Union who had also started to get involved in this movement, that an agreement in principle had already been signed between Concordia and PepsiCo, and that the final contract was being signed that week. So the next day, there was a proxy meeting that had been set up by Marc Gauthier with a representative from Nestle Canada, and myself as a representative of Tap Thirst in the Concordia Food Systems Group, Faisal Shinib, the environmental coordinator, and a few members of the CSU executive were meant to all come and sit down at this meeting. And it was supposed to sort of be a proxy. Instead of meeting with Pepsi, we're going to meet with Nestle instead. And I sort of saw this as the university had been trying to sort of limit the scope of this movement and frame it exclusively around bottled water, and not touch the issue of this exclusivity contract and lack of sustainability in the food and beverage system. So for myself and for others in the organization, in the movement, this was like a joke, no, we're supposed to be talking with Pepsi, we're supposed to be talking about an exclusivity contract. We're not supposed to be talking with a representative from Nestle who also sits who is also involved with the Canadian Association for Bottled Water, and talking only about one product. This is where the movement started, but this is not where it was at this point in time. And we felt that this was, this was a move to weaken the movement. So that meeting sort of we already had our doubts around that meeting, and then the day prior we were tipped off. So I basically contacted a number of people in the organization, in Tap Thirst, people at Sustainable Concordia, at CUPERG Concordia, at the graduate students union level, at the CSU level, and we sort of started spreading the word, and many people were involved. I can't stress the number of people who dedicated so much of their time and energy and passion and heart into this thing, and how incredibly blown away I was by the show of solidarity in front of the GM building on October 27th. It was insane, We showed up and everybody had come together. And for myself, it was also a really wonderful moment, because over the summer I had been sort of chosen by media and by the administration, sort of picked out as the face of the campaign, and that was something that I wasn't really comfortable with. So this protest was a really wonderful moment for me to sort of say to the university, it's not just me, Like, this has always been way bigger than that, and way more significant than that. So we held a big protest outside of the GM building, and when the time of the meeting came close, the movement decided that all of the students would accompany the representatives into the GM building, and they would stage a sit-in protest. And I walked into that meeting room with Faisal and with members of the CSU, and Marc Gauthier was there, and the representative of Nestle was there. And right off the bat, I said, this meeting is not the meeting that was meant to be taking place. There are lots of students that are sitting out in the hall that have questions that they would like you to answer. Those students were not allowed in. There was quite a heavy security presence there, preventing students from actually entering the office where the meeting was taking place. Marc Gauthier was extremely patronizing and placating, and openly denied any verbal agreement to make no movement on the Pepsi file until we had met together, which was a blatant lie. So I basically told him that I was not going to stand for being patronized and lied to, and that I would be sitting with the students outside in the hall if at any point he decided that he wanted to come out and be accountable.
So it would be great if you could describe to us what Tapthirst was, how it started, and basically its purpose, and I guess what came out of Tapthirst.
Okay. Tapthirst started in 2007. It was sort of born out of my complete disbelief at the amount of plastic waste on campus. I started here, 2007 was my first semester at Concordia, and I remember sitting in one of the lecture halls, and after class, there being 20 plastic bottles sitting on desks or under desks or on the floor, and just thinking to myself, like, this is a university. Shouldn't we be smarter than this? So my friend Alyssa Campbell, who was studying at McGill, and I decided to apply to Cupid Concordia to start a working group called Tapthirst, Tap Drinkers Against Privatization. So that organization was born in October of 2007, and since then has undergone a few different transformations. We started to get bigger. We were holding workshops and panel discussions and tabling events and movie screenings, working closely with the Polaris Institute in Ottawa, with the Sierra Youth Coalition, with Cupid Concordia, and really trying to tackle the issue of bottled water on campus. So as we were looking into this, we also got involved with larger issues of sustainability, started looking at the food and beverage system as a whole, and looking at the nature of exclusivity contracts within universities and how they act as one of the major barriers against a more sustainable food and beverage system. So Tapthirst in 2010, I believe it was the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, applied to the Sustainable Action Fund for funding for coordinators. So for the last few years, it functioned still as a Cupid working group, but with Sustainable Action Fund funding for coordinators, and worked closely with the Concordia Food Systems Group, as well as the other movements and organizations that I mentioned. So Tapthirst was really instrumental as an organization in the bottled water campus movement, or bottled water free campus movement, and also in this movement around the renegotiation of the PepsiCo contract.
So what are some of the barriers that you guys came across in the campaign with the beverage contracts, and what did you learn from this experience?
That's a great question. One of the major pitfalls of the movement in 2010 was that a lot of the legwork took place over the summer, when there weren't a lot of students around, and the administration tends to act and move even slower. Another pitfall was the fact that myself and others in the organization who were around were kept running through, we're just kept busy with a lot of busy work. things that were assigned by the administration that we were led to believe would concretely help or concretely work towards opening a space for dialogue and a position for students to influence the nature of this upcoming contract. So that includes, all of the reports that I compiled for Michael DeGrappa and Judith Woodsworth, petitions that were signed, executive summary sheets. The university at one point said, okay, this bottled water thing, we're kind of on board, but we can't do it unless the water fountains are up to snuff. So we need to figure out, we need to know exactly the conditions of every single water fountain in every single building on campus. So TapThirst volunteers in the fall of 2010 were kept busy going around to every single water fountain in every single building on both of Concordia's campuses with floor plans marking out the exact location, the make, the model, and the condition of those water fountains. And these were all sort of framed as precursors to any concrete involvement of students in the decision-making process. Another pitfall was surrounding the bottled water movement versus, or bottled water free campus movement versus the anti-exclusivity contract movement. So this was actually one student movement that had the larger goal, supported by the Environmental Advisory Committee, of a non-exclusive, locally sourced, healthy, organic, sustainable food and beverage contract. And the Concordia administration and the Montreal media, to a great extent, kept reframing this movement as only about bottled water. So that really constricted the efficacy of the movement, the perception of the movement in terms of the wider community, and I think ultimately stunted the movement in a lot of ways. Another pitfall that I came across when I was getting people to sign the petition towards a more sustainable food and beverage contract was the fact that professors at the university were either scared or disheartened to show their support. So professors, I would go and meet with professors in their office, and I'm not going to name names, but they would say to me, or via email, and they would say to me, I strongly believe in this. You have no idea how much. I wish I could do something to change it, but it's either A, completely useless because nobody ever listens to me and the university is never going to change their tune, or B, I don't have tenure yet and I'm afraid of losing my job. So that was something that I hadn't anticipated encountering, and that was really kind of disheartening for me as well, having been an undergraduate student who really looked up to professors and saw them as people with people in relative positions of power and authority in the university. Another thing that hit me really hard on a personal level, but I saw this in a lot of other individuals that were active in the movement, was this activist burnout. And this was hugely related to the increased skepticism and mistrust that I had in university administration. So there was this feeling that the university only really stepped up and addressed the issue when students started protesting, when we went to the media, when there was bad publicity, when there was bad PR, when their reputation as a leader in sustainability was at stake. This is obviously something that can be used as leverage, going to the media and saying, Concordia claims to be this, now prove it. But yeah, very disheartening to sort of see that happening. The other thing, big thing, was the fact that university administrators were actually lying to students. And I have documented evidence of this. I have proof of this. I filed mise en demeure, a notice of legal action against Joanne Descoubelis, Marc Gauthier, and Michael DeGrappa for lying to the student movement, to myself specifically as a representative of TapThirst and of the Concordia Food Systems Working Group. saying that, you know, no movement would be made on the PepsiCo file until we had all sat down and had a multi-stakeholder meeting. And of course, that meeting never took place, and an agreement in principle was signed in secret. And as David Burnens has showed through the evidence that he has acquired through invoking the Freedom of Information Act, there were emails that were passed between Michael DeGrappa and Marc Gauthier discussing the student movement specifically. Are the students still motivated? I'm organizing this meeting with Nestle to dissuade them against pursuing a bottled water-free campus. Like, this was actually happening. Collusion, lying, hugely disheartening for the movement. Another major thing for myself was the impotency of the Environmental Advisory Committee. You have this committee that's comprised of a number of different stakeholders throughout the university community, and it's been tasked with making concrete recommendations for the university in terms of its policy and its practices. This committee falls under the VP Services, reports to the VP Services, and is supposed to influence the actions undertaken by the university. So the Environmental Advisory Committee sat, I met with them, and Faisal Shanib, the environmental coordinator, who works closely with Sustainable Concordia as well, we met, we came up with a list of recommendations to be put into an RFP for this exclusivity contract, and at the end of the day, even though we were informed by Joanne de Cubelis and Marc Gauthier that this was the way to have our criteria incorporated into the decision-making process, it was completely ignored. Never referenced, never incorporated. So that was also a huge pitfall. So much time and energy and, you know, so many resources went into getting stakeholders on board, opening a space for dialogue, coming up with criteria towards a more sustainable food and beverage contract, going through the right protocol, going through the right avenues, addressing the specific departments and subcommittees and organizations within the university administration, basically towing the line and making sure that we were doing everything that we were told we needed to do, and at the end of the day, being faced with an exclusivity contract renewal. You know, so that was a major thing for me. Why have an environmental advisory committee if you're not going to take their advice? It's a waste of time. It's a joke. So knowing what I know now, and having not really thought about this for the last 2 years because I needed to take a break, I would definitely put more energy into creating allies with different departments, organizations within the university, getting stakeholders on board and continuing to open up that dialogue, getting people like the David O'Brien Center for Sustainable Enterprise, the John Molson Sustainability Group, the new Concordia Food Coalition, which just sounds incredible and amazing. Having those stakeholders on board, working with the Dean of Students Office. I mean, the previous movement did all of these things, but was ultimately trying to fit itself within the framework that the university administration had provided, was trying to navigate the streams, the map that was set out by the Concordia administration. So I think reestablishing contact with the signatories of that original petition, sort of re-engaging and reopening that dialogue, I think is an excellent way to move forward. I would also focus more this time around on building alternative models. You know, don't let yourself get bogged down in meeting the needs of the administration. You know, coming up with useless cost-benefit analyses for contracts that you don't know the stipulations of. You know, just focus on thinking of concrete alternatives and finding ways to make that sustainable. If you do find yourself wanting to undertake a cost-benefit analysis and having some numbers to work with, you know, now that we have some access to details in the previous contract through the Access to Information Act, you know, in engaging students in the John Molson School of Business to undertake that work. You know, as a human geography student, an anthropology student, I'm interested in these things, but I'm not necessarily the most equipped. And also outsourcing those projects to other sectors of the university increases buy-in. It increases the scope of this multi-stakeholder movement. Another thing that's really important and that we really saw at the crux of the movement around the protest at the end of October is that a strong, mobilized student movement is necessary. As much as I want to believe, and I've always wanted to believe, that the university administration itself believes in the environmental policy that it has legislated, at the end of the day, from what I have seen, the university continues to think of the spheres of environment, politics, and social sustainability as encompassed or encapsulated by financial economic concerns. So in looking at a cost-benefit analysis within the university administration framework, that's always going to come down to the bottom line of dollar values. Is this going to cost the university money, or is it going to save the university money? And that's something that I've seen working with Sustainable Concordia and as the Sustainable Ambassadors Program Coordinator as well, that the university is keen to adopt any environmental or social sustainability endeavors if it saves the money, if it makes them look good. But if it's expensive, if it means sacrificing a lucrative exclusivity contract, then that's not going to happen. So building alternative frameworks and not getting bogged down in trying to frame the movement within the administration, because as far as I'm concerned, the two are incommensurable, right? So finding ways to institutionalize alternatives without compromising them.
Could you describe to me the report that you produced for Satoshi Akita's class about the food and beverage contracts across Canadian universities?
Sure. So in the summer of 2010, I was one of the interns for the Concordia Food Systems Working Group. Myself and a number of students were tasked with looking at alternatives, coming up with alternatives to the food and beverage system at Concordia towards a more sustainable food and beverage system. I looked specifically at a number of different universities in Canada, looked at best case practices. For example, the University of British Columbia has a wonderful farm on site. We looked at ways that we can incorporate urban agriculture into Concordia. There was quite a lot of overlap actually between the Concordia Greenhouse and the Food Systems Working Group at that time. I was looking specifically into the nature of exclusivity contracts, finding that at a lot of universities in Canada, in fact, the majority of Canadian universities, the food and beverage system was almost entirely ruled by or falling under the purview of exclusivity contracts with major corporations like Pepsi or Nestle, Chartwells. So at Concordia, we had an exclusivity contract that was going to be expiring with Pepsi in 2010 and then Chartwells in 2015. So myself and Megan Benit McDonald at the end took all of the information that was compiled by students and we put it into a big visual table with photos and columns for each university, basically indicating what the nature of exclusivity contracts was in that university and listing a number of movements towards a sustainable food and beverage system, whether it was cooperative cafes or farm-to-university systems or any other initiatives or organizations. I specifically was also working on, as part of that internship, building a movement around the negotiation of a more sustainable food and beverage contract when the PepsiCo contract expired. So a large portion of the report that I compiled was my experiences as a student that summer, gaining access to information about how the university worked. I state at the beginning of my report, and I just read it for the first time in a couple of years. In some ways, it's really terrible, and in other ways I think it's really important, or at least I hope. But I stated at the beginning, this report is intended to inform students who are attempting to enact change on campus, so that they don't have to go through the same learning process that I did, coming into the university and saying, okay, I want to change the food and beverage system. Who do I talk to? And going through Hospitality Concordia, finding out about the purview of the VP services, etc. So part of that report that I compiled is actually a chart that shows the structure of the university administration, and in detail the VP services and which segments of that office pertain specifically to decisions or play a role in decisions pertaining to the food and beverage system. So I tried to identify key actors in the administration and also key stakeholders within the university, and to try and engage those stakeholders in the university, all the while recording and mapping out my efforts so that later on down the line, someone who wanted to do the same thing, or other people who actually, I would not recommend doing the same thing. It was very time consumptive. The point of it was so that people wouldn't have to do the same thing, so that they could come in and say, okay, I know who signs this exclusivity contract. And it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's amazing how long it took me to find that out. And I like to think that I'm not a complete idiot. I wasn't just bumbling around asking the wrong people the wrong questions. I do feel like I was being actively prevented from accessing that information. And of course, the epitome of that process of obfuscation is the exclusivity contract itself, right? So the number of times that I was told, you need to invoke the Access to Information Act. And I am so happy that David Burnins did, and that we finally have some of that information. So that I would add to the stockpile of information that we gathered over that time that can really help students who are now students and professors and organizations and departments and other stakeholders, community members of the university that are trying to enact positive change.
How would you see an ideal food and beverage system at Concordia University?
Okay. I'm actually going to read these Environmental Advisory Committee recommendations, because they were and still are, I think, the best way to move forward in terms of negotiating a better food and beverage system at this university. So the main principles that we came up with in that meeting were that this contract should be, or that the food system, that it should play out with a clear, democratic, and transparent negotiation of a future beverage contract or contracts. So this would be food and beverage contracts. So clear, democratic, transparent, and accountable. So this would mean creating space for students, for community members, for multiple stakeholders within the university to express what they want to see in a food system, and to have those desires incorporated into the manifestation of the food and beverage system. The second thing was a beverage contract that doesn't include bottled water. So that we actually had a modicum of success with. That was the administration's one concession. The third was a food system that ensures health-conscious, environmentally conscious products with a quota for locally supplied and organic products. The fourth thing was a non-exclusive contract. So this would allow for the opportunity of multiple food and beverage service providers, also allow for the opportunity of local small-scale food and beverage suppliers. So to have food supplied, for example, by the Jardin de la Résistance, if you could go to the cafeteria and have a salad with spinach that was grown, at a farm just an hour and a half away, versus a salad with tomatoes that came from Mexico, that would be amazing. And the last thing, okay, so So these objectives, so those were basically the objectives, or the outline for the objectives. So then the objectives that were approved for recommendation and actually put forward to the VP Services and to the Executive Director of Business and Financial Operations were no individually packaged bottled water or individually packaged water sold through any contract on campus, that the contracts would ensure health-conscious, environmentally and socially conscious products, in keeping with the university's sustainability mandate as specified in the university's strategic plan, with 30% of all products supplied locally. The criteria for the contracts would not include exclusivity rights, therefore allowing for the opportunity of having alternatively supplied beverages on campus and multiple suppliers. The negotiation of the contracts should be clear, democratic, and transparent as per Law 65.1, the Act respecting contracting by public bodies. So in this sense, we were also invoking Quebec legislation. So this law would imply that contracts would be open to bidding by multiple companies, that there would be criteria for prospective suppliers in the form of an RFP, and that criteria would be public information, that the selection process would be transparent, publicly available, and publicized, that the process would be fair, and that no one company would be favored over another. And those objectives were all passed, if my memory serves me, unanimously at the Environmental Advisory Committee level. So I still think that is the way to move forward.
As you might be aware, in 2015, there's a new RFP to bid on a beverage contract at Concordia taking place. Mm-hmm. And I want to get your thoughts on that. So going forward, is there a way to have an RFP that has some kind of a positive outcome, or what are your thoughts or feelings towards that?
Well, as I've expressed, I do feel that the RFP process is important in terms of being able to concretely incorporate the criteria that were recommended by the Environmental Advisory Committee. That being said, I still have my doubts as to the efficacy of the RFP process in terms of fully incorporating the desires of the university community. And that's because at the end of the day, when you're dealing with the people that are signing this contract, the financial question is always the bottom line. Economic sustainability, or as Marc Gauthier phrased it to me at one point, he phrased it to me once as a matter of social sustainability, in that if the university doesn't sign an exclusivity contract, it's losing out on a massive amount of income and people could lose their jobs. I wonder if at the time he was maybe referring to himself and the fact that if he didn't get this contract through the door, he'd lose his job. But in any case, it really does speak to the fact that environmental and social concerns unfortunately don't necessarily override financial considerations in the context of university administrative decision making. So I do believe that there needs to be a democratic, transparent, open bidding process. But I also think that it could be multiple contracts. I don't see why it has to be an exclusivity contract. If we don't, if the university doesn't confine itself to financial considerations and to a dependency on corporations to meet its bottom line, which is inherently problematic in a number of ways, then we can start to think and envision alternatives for the future. But if at the end of the day it always comes down to a question of money, well then there's no way that any of these alternative producers or suppliers are going to be able to give as much money to the university as Coke or Pepsi or Nestle. So there has to be not just criteria, but a relative weighting of criteria. And one way to do that as well is to further institutionalize and entrench those values in other organizations and bodies within the university. So at the level of the Concordia Student Union, we saw that a referendum on a bottled water-free campus was a major turning point in the movement. That is what made the university say, okay, it's happening. It wouldn't have happened without that, right? So, similarly, maybe we can have a referendum that says, we don't want an exclusivity contract. I mean, that would be one way to move forward. And to do that not just at the CSU level, but at the GSU level. If the David O'Brien Center for Sustainable Enterprise came out and said, hey, there are other alternatives, they're the experts in this stuff. I'm sure that someone in the JMSB could come up with a great concrete alternative to exclusivity contracts, could do a great cost-benefit analysis and figure out, relative weighting. I mean, it's kind of an impossible task to measure environmental and social sustainability against dollars, because at the end of the day, I think those things are priceless, right? An ecologically sound and socially just world is priceless. We shouldn't have to compare that to how much money the university is going to get for only allowing Pepsi on campus. That shouldn't be a thing that we have to do, but that's a thing that we're tasked with doing. So yeah, at the end of the day, I think I'm still rather ambivalent and equal parts optimistic and disheartened, and above all, really excited to see what people come up with, because I have ideas, but I'm just one person, and I know that there are so many awesome and better ideas that people are coming up with right now. And I've been away from the university for a number of years, but I can't wait to see how this next contract negotiation plays out, and to see how students and professors and Board of Governors representatives create space for this dialogue and create space, claim space, more than create it, I think is what needs to happen in this university, and what I've seen happen in this university, to claim space for change.
Could you describe some of these alternatives that you're talking about, alternatives looking at maybe non-multinational corporations or other things that you think could actually replace the Pepsi contract?
Sure thing. One of the concrete alternatives that I found while I was doing research with the Concordia Food Systems Working Group was the Coopérative d'Alentour, which is based out of Sherbrooke, Quebec. They're a distributor specializing in supplying healthy and environmentally conscious product lines. So this includes the Black River Juice Company, based out of Mississauga, Ontario. You can buy Black River juice at the Frigo Vert, and I mean, the Frigo Vert is where I used to go for all of my food and beverage stuff on campus, because they're just fantastic in terms of having a socially and environmentally ethical purchasing policy. Like, they're just, so I think we can also look to organizations that already exist on campus, cooperatives that already exist on campus, in terms of how to go about doing this. But the Coopérative d'Alentour was one distributor that I found that could potentially meet a lot of the criteria that were outlined by the Environmental Advisory Committee. At the time, in 2010, they were supplying to l'Université de Québec à Montréal, UQAM, and l'Université de Sherbrooke, as well as a number of cégep throughout the province. They have a strong commitment to quality, consumer satisfaction, and sustainability. They only carry products that adhere to the values of the cooperative, so there's no glucose, fructose, no refined sugar. It's health conscious, organic wherever possible, no preservatives, and they also have a mandate to source as locally as possible. So finding a distributor like this that can operate at the scale of the university institution, and that already has a mandate that aligns with the university's environmental policy and that aligns with potential criteria in the RFP, would be one way to move forward. They also have an incredible hierarchical sourcing, local sourcing approach, where they start looking for products in Quebec first, and then they expand to Ontario, and finally to the rest of Canada. And they're extremely transparent in terms of how their products are sourced. So the products that come from Vancouver travel by train to Montreal. Like in terms of being able to map out the food and beverage system and where specific products are coming from, working with a distributor like this, working with a cooperative like this would be an amazing way to move forward. They also have a partnership with Recyc Québec and are very committed to using recyclable and recycled packaging. They also deal directly with producers. They are the middleman, the wholesaler, and the distributor. So this is another way that the university can be more in touch with where their food and beverages are actually coming from, to really minimize the obfuscation and links that make that commodity chain hard to follow. Another great thing about the cooperative, and I'm sure you could find this in other similar cooperatives, is that they don't enter into contracts with their clients. So this, in a way, problematizes the RFP process, because with the coopérative d'alentour, they would fill the vending machines, but they wouldn't ask you to sign a contract saying that only they were allowed to fill the vending machines for the next 10 years. They also wouldn't give you X number of dollars per year for the right to do so, but I think that the trade-off is more than fair if you consider environmental and sustainable costs above potential financial costs. So their minimum shipping order, $450. The market dictates the price of products. They don't demand fixed pricing from their producers, which is something amazing. That means that if the producer's having a really tough tomato season, they're not obligated to supply the university a certain amount of tomatoes for a certain price and potentially cripple that particular producer. So the price of the produce is allowed to reflect whatever particular hardships the producer is facing. And so overall, within this cooperative framework, quality and service are more important than profit. And I think that's something that the university needs to align themselves with. So I spoke with a member of the Coopérative d'Alentour back in 2010, and I have a quote from him that I want to read that I think is really wonderful. We were discussing the shift that he was observing within university food and beverage sourcing from big companies towards smaller, locally based distributors, and he was talking specifically about the cooperative, saying, "We are David against Goliath. We are fighting among giants. When people buy through us, they show that they support us and this type of system." He says that he is a father and is motivated by his concern over what he's feeding his kids. So I think that that's one great way to go. And that was something that I brought to Marc Gauthier and that I presented to Michael de Grappa, and that I researched and that I found, and that I thought was a very concrete alternative to an organization, a corporation, a multinational corporation like Pepsi or Coca-Cola. Another route to go is to have multiple smaller contracts or non-contracts, to have multiple suppliers. It requires more organization. There's less financial income to the university, but at the end of the day, there needs to be compromise somewhere, and the way that the current system stands, we are compromising environmental and social sustainability in favor of efficiency and financial profit, and I think that we need to flip that on its head.